Snow crunches beneath worn leather boots as prospectors stumble through the muddy streets, their breath forming crystalline clouds in the bitter air. The scent of wood smoke mingles with the aroma of whiskey and tobacco that drifts from every saloon door. This is a place where survival meant more than finding gold. It meant protecting what you had already claimed. The year was 1896, and the Klondike Gold Rush had transformed Dawson City from a frozen wilderness into a chaotic boomtown where fortunes were made and lost faster than the northern wind could howl through the timber buildings. In the heart of this wild frontier stood the McAllister Saloon, its weathered wooden facade bearing witness to countless stories of triumph and heartbreak, but perhaps none more compelling than the tale of Claire McAllister, whose flame-red hair caught the lamplight like spun copper, and whose emerald eyes held secrets deeper than the gold veins running beneath the permafrost. Claire stood behind the mahogany bar of the McAllister Saloon, polishing a glass tumbler with methodical precision. Her father's saloon had become her entire world since his death 6 months prior, when a fever had taken him as surely as the harsh winter claimed so many others. She wore a deep green dress, the color of Yukon pines after rain, with intricate beadwork along the bodice, the fabric practical yet feminine, designed to command respect in a room full of rough men while still honoring her position as a lady. Her red hair was pinned back, sleek and low at the nape of her neck, though rebellious strands escaped to frame her face, giving her an air of controlled wildness that seemed to suit the untamed landscape surrounding them. The saloon itself told stories through every scratch on its wooden floors and every nick in the bar top. Kerosene lamps cast dancing shadows across walls adorned with faded photos and hand-drawn maps marking claims throughout the territory. The air hung thick with cigar smoke and the perpetual dampness that seemed to seep through every building in this godforsaken town. Card tables occupied the center of the room, where men in wool coats and mud-stained trousers gathered nightly to test their luck against fate and each other. But Claire's peaceful evening routine was about to be shattered by the arrival of a man whose very presence seemed to drain warmth from the room. Thornton Graves entered the McAllister Saloon with the confidence of someone who believed the entire world owed him a debt. His black wool overcoat was tailored to perfection, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn clothing worn by most residents of Dawson City. Gold pocket watch chains glinted against his vest, and his dark hair was slicked back. Everything about Thornton spoke of wealth and power, but his pale gray eyes held a coldness that made even hardened prospectors step aside when he passed. "Good evening, Miss McAllister," Thornton said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey but twice as poisonous. "I trust business has been profitable despite these challenging times." Claire's grip tightened on the glass she was cleaning, but her expression remained composed. "The saloon provides what it always has, Mr. Graves, an honest drink and fair games for hard-working men." "How admirable," Thornton replied, though his smile never reached those calculating eyes. "However, I fear your father's business model may not be sustainable much longer. This establishment sits on some of the most valuable real estate in Dawson City. The land beneath your feet could be worth more than all the gold pulled from the creeks combined." The other patrons had grown quiet, sensing the tension crackling between the saloon owner and the well-dressed businessman. Claire could feel their eyes upon her, waiting to see how she would handle this veiled threat. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but years of managing drunk prospectors had taught her to never show weakness. "My father built this saloon with his own hands," she said, her voice steady, despite the fear creeping up her spine. "Every board, every nail represents his blood and sweat. It is not for sale, at any price." Thornton's laugh was as cold as the wind howling outside. "My dear Claire, you misunderstand the nature of business in a growing town. Progress waits for no one, especially not sentimental young women clinging to the past. I am prepared to make you a generous offer. Marry me and you can continue managing this establishment under my guidance. Refuse and I will simply purchase the property through other means." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a snuffed candle. Claire's emerald eyes flashed with indignation, But before she could formulate a response, the saloon doors swung open with enough force to rattle their hinges. Every head turned toward the entrance where a stranger stood silhouetted against the snowy night. The newcomer was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark brown hair that curled slightly at the edges where it brushed his coat collar. His clothing marked him as neither prospector nor businessman, but something in between. A well-worn leather jacket hung open over a clean white shirt, and his dark trousers were tucked into sturdy boots that had seen their share of hard travel. But it was his eyes that captured attention, a startling blue that seemed to take in every detail of the room in a single glance. "Pardon the interruption," the stranger said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that suggested origins far south of the frozen territories. "I was hoping to find lodging for the night and perhaps a hot meal." Claire felt her breath catch in her throat as those blue eyes met hers across the crowded room. Something stirred within her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the wood-burning stove in the corner. She found herself smoothing her skirts and tucking an errant strand of hair behind her ear before she could stop herself. "We have rooms available upstairs," she managed to say, though her voice sounded strangely breathless to her own ears. "And our kitchen serves meals until midnight." The stranger approached the bar with an easy confidence that made several of the rougher patrons straighten in their chairs. Up close, Claire could see that his face bore the weathered look of someone who spent considerable time outdoors, but his hands were clean and his beard neatly trimmed. He carried himself with the bearing of a gentleman, yet something in his manner suggested he could handle himself in less civilized company. "Carter Rowe," he said, extending his hand to Claire. "I appreciate the hospitality, Miss McAllister," she replied, feeling an unexpected jolt of electricity when their hands touched. "Claire McAllister. This is my establishment." Thornton cleared his throat loudly, clearly displeased at being ignored during what he considered an important business discussion. "And I am Thornton Graves," he announced, puffing out his chest like a peacock displaying his plumage. "I own several enterprises throughout Dawson City and was just discussing some business matters with Miss McAllister." Carter's gaze shifted to Thornton, and Claire noticed how those friendly blue eyes seemed to grow several degrees cooler. "Forgive me," Carter said politely. "I didn't mean to interrupt your conversation." "Not at all," Claire said quickly, shooting Thornton a meaningful look. "Mr. Graves was just leaving. Perhaps we can continue our discussion another time when I have had an opportunity to consider his proposal more thoroughly." Thornton's jaw tightened with barely contained anger, but he managed to maintain his practiced smile. "Of course, my dear, but don't take too long with your considerations. Opportunities in business, like chances at happiness, don't wait indefinitely for those who hesitate." With that thinly veiled threat, Thornton gathered his coat and hat, nodding curtly to Carter before making his exit. The tension in the room seemed to evaporate with his departure, and the low murmur of conversation gradually resumed among the other patrons. "Seems like a charming fellow," Carter observed dryly, settling onto a bar stool with fluid grace. Despite everything, Claire found herself smiling for the first time all evening. "About as charming as a rattlesnake in a flower garden," she replied. "Can I get you something to drink while I prepare your room?" "Whiskey would be fine," Carter said, "and perhaps you could tell me what kind of business proposal has you looking like you have swallowed something particularly unpleasant." Claire poured 2 fingers of her finest whiskey into a clean glass, studying Carter's face as she did so. There was something about this stranger that made her want to confide in him, though she couldn't quite identify what inspired such unusual trust. "Mr. Graves believes he owns this town," she said finally. "He has been pressuring me to sell the saloon ever since my father passed away. Tonight, he suggested I marry him as an alternative to losing everything I have left of my family." Carter's hand tightened around his glass, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "And what did you tell him?" "That the saloon is not for sale at any price," Claire replied firmly. "This place represents everything my father worked for. I would rather burn it to the ground than hand it over to that snake." "Good for you," Carter said, raising his glass in a mock toast. "A woman who knows her own mind is a rare and valuable thing in any territory." Over the following weeks, Carter Rowe became a fixture at the McAllister Saloon. He had paid for his room in advance with enough gold dust to cover a month's lodging, claiming he was considering various business opportunities in the area. But rather than spending his days scouting claims or meeting with other entrepreneurs, Carter seemed more interested in helping Claire manage the daily operations of her establishment. He proved remarkably handy with repairs, fixing a leaky roof and reinforcing several loose floorboards that had been wobbling for months. His presence behind the bar during busy evenings helped maintain order among the more boisterous patrons, and Claire noticed that fights broke out far less frequently when Carter was working the room. He had a way of diffusing tension with a well-timed joke, or by simply placing a firm hand on an aggressive drunk's shoulder. More importantly, Claire found herself looking forward to their conversations during the quiet hours between the dinner rush and the late-night poker games. Carter had traveled extensively throughout the Western Territories, and his stories of life beyond the frozen wilderness filled her with longing for adventures she had never dared imagine. He spoke of California vineyards where grapes grew fat and sweet under endless sunshine, of Texas ranches that sprawled across horizons so vast they seemed to swallow the sky itself. But it was not just his tales of distant places that captivated Claire. Carter listened to her own stories with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions about her father's life and the early days of the saloon. He seemed to understand the weight of responsibility she carried, the loneliness of being the only woman trying to run a business in a town full of men who believed she had no right to such independence. One particularly cold evening, as they worked together to close down the saloon after the last patron had stumbled into the night, Claire found herself studying Carter's profile as he stacked chairs on tables. The lamplight caught the strong line of his jaw and the concentration in those remarkable blue eyes as he worked. Something had been building between them over the past weeks, a tension that had nothing to do with business concerns and everything to do with the way her heart raced whenever he smiled at her. "Carter," she said softly, causing him to look up from his task. "Why did you really come to Dawson City? And please don't tell me it was for business opportunities. I've seen enough men chasing gold to recognize the fever when I see it. And you don't have it." Carter straightened slowly, his hands still gripping the back of a wooden chair. For a long moment he said nothing, and Claire began to fear she had overstepped some invisible boundary. But then he smiled, and the warmth in his expression made her feel as though she were standing too close to the wood stove. "You're right," he admitted. "I was not entirely honest about my reasons for coming here. The truth is, I was running from something back in Colorado, made some enemies in a business deal that went sour, and they were the type of men who settle disputes with bullets rather than lawyers." Claire felt her heart sink. "So you're planning to leave once it's safe to return?" "I was," Carter said quietly, "but that was before I met a remarkable woman with fire in her hair and enough courage to stand up to men twice her size. Now I find myself thinking that maybe what I was running from was not as important as what I might be running toward." The next evening, as Claire was preparing to serve dinner to the usual crowd of hungry prospectors, Thornton Graves returned to the McAllister Saloon with reinforcements. Two large men in dark coats flanked him as he strode through the saloon doors, their presence causing the cheerful conversation to die away into nervous silence. "Miss McAllister," Thornton announced loudly enough for everyone to hear, "I have come to collect your final answer regarding my generous offer. Surely you have had sufficient time to consider the wisdom of accepting my proposal." Claire's hands trembled as she set down the tray of drinks she had been carrying, but her voice remained steady when she replied. "My answer is the same as it was before, Mr. Graves. The saloon is not for sale, and I have no intention of marrying you or anyone else simply to protect my property." Thornton's smile was as cold as the winter wind rattling the windows. "How unfortunate. I had hoped we could resolve this matter in a civilized fashion, but you seem determined to make things difficult. Very well. I hereby inform you that I have purchased your outstanding debts from various creditors throughout the territory. The total amount owed is far more than this establishment could generate in revenue over the next 5 years. You have until tomorrow evening to settle these debts in full, or I will be forced to seize the property as collateral." The words hit Claire like a physical blow. She knew her father had borrowed money to keep the saloon running during particularly harsh winters, but she had assumed those debts were manageable. If Thornton had indeed consolidated them all, the total could easily exceed anything she could possibly pay. "That is impossible," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she could see from Thornton's triumphant expression that he held all the legal documentation necessary to back up his claim. "I assure you it is entirely possible," Thornton replied smoothly. "However, my previous offer remains open. Marry me, and I will forgive these debts entirely. You can continue operating the saloon under my guidance, and we can build a profitable partnership together." The thought of being tied to this cold, calculating man for the rest of her life made Claire feel physically ill. But before she could formulate any kind of response, Carter appeared at her side as if materializing from thin air. His presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the room, and Claire noticed that even Thornton's hired muscle seemed to grow more alert. "Seems like you have quite an interesting business model, Mr. Graves," Carter said conversationally, "buying up debts and using them to force people into unwanted partnerships. Tell me, is that legal approach common practice in your other enterprises?" "This is none of your concern, stranger," Thornton replied curtly. "This is a private matter between Miss McAllister and myself." "Actually," Carter said, his voice remaining perfectly pleasant even as his eyes grew dangerously cold, "I think it concerns anyone who cares about fair dealing and honest business practices. So let me make you a counter-proposal." The entire saloon had grown so quiet that Claire could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. Every patron, every worker, even Thornton's hired men seemed to be holding their breath as they waited to see what would happen next. "What sort of counter-proposal?" Thornton asked suspiciously. "A simple game of poker," Carter replied. "High stakes, winner takes all. If you win, Miss McAllister will agree to your terms without further argument. But if I win, you forgive all debts, return any documentation you have collected, and leave Dawson City permanently. Are you man enough to risk your schemes on the turn of a card?" Thornton's eyes gleamed with greed and anticipated victory. He clearly believed he held all the advantages in such a contest, assuming that some frontier drifter could never match his experience at the gaming tables of San Francisco and Denver. "You would stake Miss McAllister's future on a game of chance?" Thornton asked mockingly. "How very gallant of you." "I'm staking my own future," Carter replied quietly, his gaze finding Claire's across the room. "Because if I lose this game, I lose everything that matters to me." The poker game was set for the following evening, giving both men time to prepare and allowing word to spread throughout Dawson City about the unprecedented high-stakes contest. By the time the appointed hour arrived, the McAllister Saloon was packed beyond capacity, with spectators eager to witness what promised to be the most dramatic card game in the territory's brief but colorful history. A single table had been placed in the center of the room, illuminated by several kerosene lamps that cast dramatic shadows across the faces of the two competitors. Thornton had arrived dressed in his finest evening wear, a black wool suit with silver buttons and a silk vest that probably cost more than most prospectors earned in a year. His confidence radiated from every gesture as he settled into his chair and began shuffling the cards with practiced ease. Carter, by contrast, had chosen to wear his usual leather jacket over a clean white shirt, but Claire noticed he had taken extra care with his appearance. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he had shaved away several days' worth of stubble, revealing the strong line of his jaw. More importantly, his blue eyes held a steely determination that made Claire believe he truly understood what was at stake in this contest. The rules were simple enough. 5-card draw poker, best of 7 hands, with each man contributing an equal stake to ensure the game remained fair. Two neutral parties would serve as witnesses to prevent any disputes about the outcome, and the cards would be examined thoroughly before play began to ensure they had not been marked or otherwise tampered with. As the first hand was dealt, Claire found herself unable to watch the actual game. Instead, she studied the faces of the two men who held her future in their hands. Thornton's expression remained smugly confident, but she noticed a slight tremor in his fingers as he arranged his cards. Carter, meanwhile, seemed almost supernaturally calm, his breathing steady, and his movements economical as he considered his options. The first hand went to Thornton with 3 kings, earning him a satisfied nod from his hired muscle and worried murmurs from several of Claire's regular customers. But Carter showed no signs of concern as he collected the cards for the next deal, his composure as unshakable as granite. The second hand proved more interesting. Both men drew additional cards, and the tension in the room became almost unbearable as they studied their final hands. When the cards were finally revealed, Carter's straight beat Thornton's 2 pair, evening the score and causing a collective exhale from the watching crowd. As the game progressed, Claire noticed subtle signs that all was not as it should be. During the 4th hand, which Thornton won with a full house, she caught a glimpse of what appeared to be a small mirror attached to the inside of his coat sleeve. The angle would allow him to see cards as they were being dealt, giving him an enormous advantage in deciding whether to fold or continue betting. Her heart sank as she realized that Carter was playing against a cheater, and there was no way she could warn him without causing a distraction that might ruin his concentration. All she could do was watch helplessly as Thornton gradually pulled ahead, winning the 4th, 5th, and 6th hands through what appeared to be a combination of superior cards and calculated bluffing. By the time the 7th and final hand was dealt, Thornton needed only one more victory to claim the Saloon, or force Claire into an unwanted marriage in order to keep the McAllister name on the Saloon. The businessman's confidence had grown with each winning hand, and he was no longer bothering to hide his anticipated triumph. His hired muscle had moved closer to the table, clearly expecting to escort Claire away as soon as the game concluded. But Carter remained as calm as ever, studying his cards with the same methodical attention he had shown throughout the evening. When Thornton opened the betting with an aggressive raise, Carter matched it without hesitation. The stakes continued to climb as each man pushed more gold dust and coin into the center of the table, until the pot represented more wealth than most people in Dawson City would see in a lifetime. Finally, with no more cards to be drawn and no more bets to be made, the moment of truth arrived. Thornton laid down his hand with a flourish, revealing 4 aces that should have been impossible to achieve with an honest deck. His smile was triumphant as he reached for the pot, already savoring his victory. But Carter had not yet revealed his cards. Instead, he looked directly at Thornton and spoke in a voice that carried clearly throughout the packed saloon. "Interesting hand, Mr. Graves. 4 aces are indeed difficult to beat. Of course, it's also mathematically impossible when playing with an honest deck, since I happen to be holding the ace of spades right here." Carter flipped over his cards one by one, revealing a straight flush in spades from 9 to king. But more importantly, his ace of spades proved that Thornton had been playing with marked cards, since no legitimate deck could contain 5 aces. The reaction was immediate and explosive. Angry shouts erupted from throughout the crowd as men realized they had been watching a cheater in action. Several of the larger prospectors began advancing on Thornton with expressions that promised violence, while his hired muscle suddenly seemed far less confident about their ability to protect their employer. "I believe that makes me the winner," Carter said calmly, raking in the pot while keeping his eyes fixed on Thornton's pale face. "Which means you owe Miss McAllister an apology, the return of all debt documentation, and your immediate departure from Dawson City." Thornton's composure finally cracked completely. "This is preposterous," he sputtered. "You can't prove those cards were marked. This is nothing but the desperate accusation of a sore loser." But Carter was already reaching into Thornton's coat, removing the small mirror that had been concealed in his sleeve. The evidence of cheating was undeniable, and the crowd's mood grew even uglier as they realized how they had been deceived. Faced with an increasingly hostile audience and no way to deny his guilt, Thornton had no choice but to comply with the terms of their agreement. He threw a leather satchel containing all the debt papers onto the table with shaking hands, his face white with rage and humiliation. "This is not over," he hissed at Claire as his hired muscle began edging toward the door. "I have other interests in this territory, and I will not forget this insult." But his threats carried no weight now that his schemes had been exposed. Within minutes, Thornton Graves and his associates had fled into the night, leaving behind only the echoes of their footsteps in the snow-covered street. As the crowd gradually dispersed and the saloon returned to something approaching normal, Claire found herself alone with Carter in the suddenly quiet room. The events of the evening felt almost dreamlike, as though she might wake up at any moment to find Thornton still threatening her livelihood, and Carter still just a helpful stranger with kind eyes. "How did you know about the marked cards?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Carter smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features into something almost boyish. "I told you I made some enemies in Colorado over a business deal gone wrong. What I didn't mention was that the business involved a gambling house, and the enemies were other professional card players who did not appreciate my methods of ensuring honest games." "You're a professional gambler," Claire said, though somehow the revelation did not shock her as much as it should have. "Was," Carter corrected gently. "I came to Dawson City planning to start fresh, maybe try my hand at prospecting or a legitimate business. But then, I met a remarkable woman who made me realize that the most valuable thing a man can find isn't gold, but someone worth staying in one place for." Claire felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes as the full implications of what had just occurred began to sink in. Carter had risked everything to save her saloon, had put his own future on the line in a contest where cheating could have cost him far more than money. "You could have lost everything," she whispered. "I already had everything I wanted," Carter replied, crossing the room to take her hands in his. "The question is whether you want the same thing I do." Instead of answering with words, Claire stood on her tiptoes and kissed him with all the passion and gratitude and love that had been building in her heart over the past weeks. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Claire's carefully pinned hair had come loose to cascade around her shoulders in waves of copper and gold. "I love you," she said simply. "I didn't even know what love was until you walked through those doors, but now I can't imagine my life without you in it." "Then you won't have to," Carter replied, pulling her close enough that she could feel his heartbeat against her cheek. "We'll run this saloon together, and when the gold rush ends and Dawson City becomes just another quiet frontier town, we'll find new adventures to share." He kissed her softly again, the only lips she ever wanted to touch hers for the rest of her life. Outside, snow continued to fall on the frozen streets of Dawson City, but inside the McAllister Saloon, two hearts had found something more precious than any metal pulled from the earth. Claire McAllister had defended her inheritance and discovered true love in the process, while Carter Rowe had found a reason to stop running and start building a future worth fighting for. As they stood together in the lamplight, surrounded by the familiar sense of whiskey and wood smoke that would always remind them of this moment, both knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning. The Klondike might keep its gold buried beneath layers of ice and stone, but they had discovered treasure of a different sort, the kind that grows stronger with time and burns brighter than any flame man can kindle. The gold in the ground might eventually run out, but the gold in their hearts would shine forever, a beacon of hope and happiness in the endless northern wilderness. Thanks for joining us here at Gold Rush Romance, where love burns bright like the midnight sun. Loss can happen faster than a dying candle in a cold winter's wind, and redemption rides the winds of the frontier. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. More tales of courage, heart, and romance are just around the bend. Until next time.